coordinator here in the New England region of our Unitarian Universalist Association. I'm Hillary Allen, also on staff here in New England. Really glad to have you all logging on tonight. In case you want to be sure you're in the right place, you are at Centering the Margins in Outreach webinar. Hopefully that's what you gave your Wednesday night for, and we're really glad to have you all here. As I said just a moment ago, we have folks from all over the country logging in tonight, so super exciting. I'll do a little bit of a roll call in a minute to let folks know who's all here. We have over 72 people registered for tonight's webinar. It's a great group, and again, thank you for being here. And really excited about this session and the content that you're going to be hearing tonight from our presenters. This is an adaptation of a workshop that was presented at last year's General Assembly. And so many people were just really moved and taken by it. So when we scheduled our programming for this year here in New England, we knew that we wanted to include this. So excited to have you here to learn. Let me say a word about our presenters. So we have Anna Bethea, who's the outreach specialist at our Unitarian Universalist Association. You can see her waving there. Anna is a credentialed religious educator, as well as having a background in social entrepreneurship and social work. She lives in Tallahassee, Florida, and is currently contributing to the upcoming FOS collaborative curriculum called Creating Theology Together. We also will be joined by Marche Greer, who is a freedom fighter and writer and the director of public outreach, or public relations and outreach at our Unitarian Universalist Association. In her previous role, Marche was the digital content manager at the United Church of Christ. And you've probably seen her writing on the internet, but if you haven't, you can find it at marche.com. Again, I'm Hillary Allen on staff here in New England, and glad to have folks from New England and also all over the country. So let's see who's here. I'm just going to do a little bit of roll call. So if you can, wave, let us know you're here when I call you out. Of course, we have a lot of folks from Massachusetts. The Arlington Street Church in Boston, Brewster, Bridgewater, Brookline, Concord, Framingham, Great Barrington, Alden, Milton, Newton, Newburyport, Northampton, North Andover, and Westboro. Serious Massachusetts contingent. We also have folks from other parts of New England, so Portland, Maine, Burlington, Vermont, Springfield, Vermont, St. Johnsbury, Vermont, and East Greenwich, Rhode Island. And then from the rest of the country, this is super exciting. This is one of the reasons we love to do webinars, is because we can have people from all over the country, not just New England. So Fort Myers, Florida, Evanston, Illinois, Des Moines, Iowa, Omaha, Nebraska, and Aptos, California. Amazing. Awesome. So I'm going to hand it over to Anna, who's going to get us started tonight with our content. Again, please feel free to make comments and pose your questions in the chat as we go. And our presenters will come back to those at the end. But feel free to use the chat function, and we'll be keeping track of things there. If you do have any tech problems, go ahead and use the chat for that as well. Or you can chat directly to UUA meeting, which is Chanel, and we can see if we can troubleshoot as we go along. But hopefully folks are doing okay with audio and visual. So with that, Anna, Centering the Margins in Outreach.
Thank you, Hillary. Thank you, Chanel. It's really great to see all of your faces, and love seeing everyone interact, and seeing some of you in congregations and in your meeting places, obviously, in your homes. It's wonderful to be here with you. And as wonderful as technology is, sometimes it can go wrong, and I'm juggling a few different pieces here. So if for some reason you're not seeing what I'm referencing on the screen, I'll be sharing my PowerPoint with you in a little bit. if you don't see it, or for some reason my sound cuts out or something or another goes wrong, just like Hillary said, please just pop it into the chat and or unmute yourself and let me know, and we'll try to fix it as we go along. So thank you for that. And let me share my screen. Okay, so you should be seeing centering the margins and outreach work. Here is our PowerPoint, and you just got a bio for me and Marche, so you know who we are. And I'm gonna start us off with one of my favorite poems. Naomi Shihab Nye is an Arab American poet who frames kindness and balance with sorrow rather than something that's separate from it. And I'd like for us to keep this balance in mind as we consider the messages and the work that we do at the threshold of our congregations and beyond. So as I read the poem, please think about instances in your life when you've experienced sorrow and that you've longed for or received some kindness that makes it bearable. So here's Kindness by Naomi Shihab Nye. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment, like salt in a weakened froth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere like a shadow or a friend. So with this, I'm lighting my chalice here. If you have one there and would like to light it, please do. So this poem speaks to me about the possibility of our work. When we can acknowledge and speak to the deep marginalization that happens every day in our dominant culture, that's when we're really able to minister to those who are most impacted by it, both within and outside of our congregation. So I'd like to start with a little bit of a reframe of outreach. This is a change in the way that I do my work, and I know that for some people in congregations, this is also a shift in the way that we think about outreach. So I'll share a little bit about my personal story. I first became a Unitarian Universalist when I was lonely. For several years, my college friend had been leaving the city. I had been losing them little by little, and I realized that my solitary spiritual practice wasn't fulfilling me anymore. And I wanted a spiritual home where I could be among others who wanted to make the world a better place. And I was excited by the theological diversity when I first joined, and that only grew as I became a religious educator at my congregation. When I found out that there was a job for me at the UUA to help spread the good news about Unitarian Universalism, I was over the moon excited. And I knew the numbers of UUs was flat or declining, but it didn't matter. I was convinced that if others knew about the freedom to be found in our faith, many more would join. And yet, like even in my persistence and my desire for growing our faith, and especially as I grew in relationship to other UUs of color, I found that the focus on growth and what we needed to do to reach that goal to be a little bit self-serving. And over time, I found myself asking similar questions along the lines of what Halcyon questions in her piece, Worship of Numbers, which is the piece that we asked you to read before this workshop. So she talks a lot about church size theory, the theory that there are different dynamics and different systems at play, and that for you to be able to grow into the next level of a congregation's numbers, that you needed to be able to overcome certain things in your system and in your congregation. So church size theory seemed to be really logical and a great approach for outreach, thinking about how we present our faith in a way that will help other people to see the benefits and to grow our faith. But the benefits that outweigh all the other things people could bring, could be doing like on a Sunday morning, like you could be going out to play with your kids, or you could be going out into nature, or other things like that. So at the same time that we were considering those things, I was having to battle all the problematic things that come with numerical growth, such as scarcity and urgency, and some deeply hidden desires to become someone's savior, and holding on to an idea of Unitarian Universalism as the answer, and figuring out how to get like-minded people to come join. In order to keep helping congregations do outreach with a focus on growth, I had to put a lot of my own values aside in favor of self-preservation, and it didn't feel right. So I think that when we focus on growth as the goal and work backwards to figure out what we need to get to reach that goal, I believe there's a whole lot of theological misgrounding that we're doing. We're setting aside the values that we say that we have. First of all, it's coming from a grounding in scarcity, from a fear of lack, that we need more people or more money or more volunteers to just keep this whole thing going. And it also considers us the experts, that we're the bearers of a rational movement toward world peace, if only people would listen. Has anyone had that feeling before? So this misgrounding, I think, can lead to a lot of malpractice of our faith, which shows up in a fear of what our membership numbers reflect about us. What does it mean when, what does it mean that we can't ever get over a certain number of people, even though we focused on growth for all of these years? And what does it mean that we can't attract a more diverse membership, whatever that's supposed to mean? And what does it mean that we have both longtime members and relative newcomers who are leaving the fellowship? It's not a bad idea to consider these questions from time to time, but when we approach it with a hyper focus on the numbers and make that the whole point, it erodes over time at the actual ministry that we can and do provide. So our shift, this is what we're shifting from a focus on growth of numbers, and instead focusing on the needs of marginalized communities. So in centering the margins, we're practicing abundance and the enoughness of our own selves and UU faith, and practicing the skills of true relationship building, a much better basis for our outreach, don't you think? If any of you have taken a look at the sheet of characteristics of white supremacy culture by Kenneth Jones and Tuma Okun, you'll see that quantity over quality and progress is bigger and more, and paternalism are right in there. They are some of the characteristics of the white supremacy culture that we're trying to dismantle. And I heard a lot of us say that we're committed to dismantling white supremacy in the Unitarian Universalist Association. So that includes our grounding of our goals for outreach. So what we're proposing is a reframing. So you'll see on this slide that the needs of marginalized communities is being centered here. And that includes things like collaboration and affirmations, partnerships, acknowledgement, amplifying the stories of marginalized communities, access to power, access to communication, making sure that we're aware of what trauma-informed care involves for people who have gone through trauma, who have been oppressed in our society. And it centers celebration and transformation as a way for us to move forward. So I come from a social work background, and outreach for social service organizations means that we provide our services out in the community. We tell people where to come for comprehensive services, to an office or a clinic or somewhere where they can get those services. But our main goal in outreach is to get out to where the people are and to understand better the conditions of their day-to-day lives, and find out the variables and things that affect their health and their livelihoods, their family lives, their relationships with their surrounding community. And all of those inform us more about how we can better meet their needs than trying to tease it out of them in a sterile setting. So I know that many of you likely have service projects or social justice committees in your congregations who do this kind of work. So if you do, I would urge you to partner with them to tailor your outreach communications to the needs of those communities. So when we talk about outreach, that includes both the justice-centered work as well as communications, as well as greeters and membership staff. So it's a whole spectrum of things that can work together in your congregation, and getting some of those functions out of silos so that you're working together. And this really is your goal, to center the needs of marginalized communities. You can also partner with your minister or other staff if you have them in your congregation, and have an investigation into what are the needs of people of color, of LGBTQ folks, of disabled and poor folks in your community. If you are or have folks from marginalized communities in your congregation, center their experiences. They are certainly, they have a choice as to whether they want to speak from their experiences. And I know this firsthand. I have people in my congregation who ask me about my experiences, and sometimes I feel like sharing it with them, and sometimes I don't. It's really, I need to take care of myself, and sometimes that doesn't include having to share stories of my own experiences. But it means a lot to me that they ask and that they care, and sometimes we can work together in ways that really speak to some of the unspoken needs in your congregation itself, as well as the needs out in your community. So, make sure to always have a seat at the table, and welcome them into leadership, or in letting you know what their needs are. So, from transaction to transformation, this is a way for us to think about how we reach out. So outreach itself, right? That word in itself means that you're going out from where you are and reaching out. So I want to give you one more illustration of this shift from our previous model of outreach. And I call this a move from transactional outreach to transformational outreach. So imagine circles of communities. So in the center, we have UU Church of Somewhere. That is you. That's your congregation. And the green circle around it is people who maybe have visited sometimes, or are aware of your congregation but aren't necessarily a part of it. The blue circle around that are, people who are aware but have never come to your congregation. So as you can imagine, these circles of communities kind of go out from your church here in the center. So a long time ago, what we used to do with outreach was attractional. So you're trying to attract people from the outside to come to your congregation and get their services there, to come to worship service, to pledge, to give their money, to but still the focus of this approach is that your church is centered. So from there, there's also a transactional approach where you're giving out into the community, but you're still expecting something in return. So we're out here in the community helping you, and we want you to come to our church on Sunday. We want you to come and become a member. So that's a transactional kind of approach, this for that. And transformational is really what we're trying to aim for in moving us out from our congregations out into the community, where we're willing and able to be transformed by what we see, by what we encounter, the relationships that we make, the partnerships that we have with community organizations. Okay, I think that's, yes, so that's the end of my portion of our presentation. And we're gonna, I don't know that we shared this at the beginning, but we're gonna ask you to hold questions until the end, and Marche and I will both be happy to answer those questions. If you have some and you just don't want to forget about it, you can put it into the chat, and we'll go back and make sure that we look through those questions there. But if you'll hold some of your questions until the end. And Marche, are you ready?
I am ready.
Yay! All right, let me go back.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Great.
I can hear you.
At 6:58, I pulled out my headphones and they split in half. So I've had to run and find extras. So I'm so glad you could hear me. It's so nice to see y'all. I am very new to the UUA. I've been there since December of 2017. I'm the director of public relations and outreach, as they mentioned. So I'm so excited to meet some new faces and get to talk about some of the things that we've been wrestling with within our team. So Anna was so gracious enough to basically set us up for, what are we talking about when we say that we want to shift away from centering ourselves and shift to a place of centering the margins and outreach. And it's really important that we talk about framework so that when we talk about planning, we all know that we're coming from a place of the same intention. So now I want to really dig into the practical concrete. We are set up nicely to do that. And let's talk about how this might look in our day-to-day planning. Thank you so much, Anna. Can go ahead and, yes. Okay. So 2 really important questions to ask for accountable outreach work. First, you want to ask in terms of planning and in terms of where you are positioned, whether it's as a congregation, as a committee, as a person, you should understand if you're approaching the work as an ally or somebody who is impacted. Now, I'll use a couple of phrases interchangeably. I encourage you to grab on to what works for you. Some folks say, for example, ally. Some people really identify with the word accomplice. Whatever resonates with you, I encourage you to really grab onto. Impacted person, some people say marginalized, some people say impacted person, so I'll use those interchangeably. So I would encourage you to really start to think about, as we continue in the presentation, are you entering certain conversations as an ally or an impacted person? And we'll go on to talk about why. And then I would also encourage you to look at if the impact of your outreach plan matches its intention. One thing that you'll hear folks say really often, and I really swear by this phrase, impact is always greater than intent, always greater than intent. How we make people feel with what we do, how we make people feel in our congregations, how we make people feel with our work, that always is more important than how we intended to make them feel. So I'll also encourage you to think about accountability as we continue this conversation. How are you really listening? How are you really touching base with the folks who really could be impacted by being a marginalized person in your congregation, or somebody who is typically underrepresented in your community or in your congregation? And we'll go ahead and move forward, Anna. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to give you some structures around thinking about when you enter a conversation as an ally or an impacted person. I really wanted you to think about positioning here so that you can consider how you would engage with folks or how you would engage with planning based on your position as either an ally or somebody who's impacted. Again, an ally is somebody who is a person of privilege. You might hear people say majority culture. Impacted person is somebody who is marginalized. So when you're an ally, when you're talking about organizing specifically as it comes to social justice, but even as you're planning on various committees, planning in worship, you should think about how sometimes you can, for lack of a better term, take a back seat. If you're trying to be an ally and you want to make sure that people are empowered or have voice, you really want to think about how you can be a support system. And to Anna's point earlier, being a support system looks very different for different people. Somebody may really want you to get behind them as they speak out. Some people may want you to start a conversation with them involved. Some people may want you to just show up at an event. So when you're thinking about being an ally, you really want to think about how you can show support. If you're an impacted person, oftentimes that means, especially if you're dealing with something related to, again, justice work, etc., that you would be the person who's out front. We always want to remember that in these conversations, we're really talking about frameworks of support. It's not always literal. So if somebody's not comfortable being out in front of the entire congregation, that's okay. We just want to make sure that their experience and their feelings are centered, that those things are out front, even if the person's not literally out front. When we're talking about outreach messaging, especially because Anna and I do a lot of digital work for the association, so we want to help you think through your messaging about your congregation on social channels as you're advertising out in the world. When you're thinking about how to especially support marginalized people, it's really important in your messaging that you listen for cues of how impacted folks would like to be supported, and you amplify the voices of marginalized people. I'll give you an example from my work. I'm part of the public witness team in my work for the UUA. So that means when we talk about justice conversations, I'm a big part of those conversations. So a lot of times when we're thinking about how to support our partners, even though the UUA might have a particular thing that we think makes sense to say, if we're really following the lead of a group who's on the front line, of a group who is doing the work maybe in a place of more risk because of identity, because of social location, etc., then we really listen for cues from that group to indicate what we should do before making a decision about what the message should be. So we look for what those folks are saying, and we look for opportunities to amplify what they're saying instead of developing our own messaging about those things. One way that you can encourage the voices of folks who are marginalized to be out front is to really think about how you can engage folks in storytelling and first-person sharing. There's really no better way to understand somebody's perspective and point of view than to really hear their story and to really validate and listen to their stories. So I would encourage you to think about where there might be storytelling opportunities in various communities within your congregation, and then where might you lift certain narratives of folks who are in your community doing work that involves a lot of risk, or where might you lift the voices of folks in your community who are marginalized for various reasons. In terms of listening, and I apologize, listening is somewhat, can be somewhat of an ableist phrase. I'm not trying to imply anything about hearing. I'm just trying to apply, maybe a better way to say that would have been to pay attention to. Pay attention to privilege. If you are an ally, how can you at all times really think about how your privilege is informing how you're reacting to something, and how might you not only maybe have some wrestling, confession, reckoning with that, but how might you engage with those around you who also have the same types of privileges, and how might you work with folks who also have privilege so that you can help dismantle privilege among yourselves. One thing that I always try to emphasize to folks is emotional labor is labor. It's real. So if you can really shift the burden of education, of thinking about privilege, around correcting and educating around systems of oppression, if you can shift that onto privileged folks instead of folks who are impacted or marginalized, you're saving folks emotional labor. And then I also like to remind folks who are part of impacted groups to challenge intergroup marginalization. So just because you have privilege in one place does not mean that you have privilege in all places. Just because you're marginalized in some ways doesn't mean you're marginalized in all ways. So a good example of this would be, I'm in the LGBTQ community and I'm a Black person. So in LGBTQ spaces that are predominantly white, I might ask for a white person to be my ally and to really to interrogate their privilege and privilege of others. But if I, as a cis woman, were in a space with LGBTQ Black folks, then I might be the person who's interrogating my privilege as a cis person who is not trans. So I always encourage people to really wrestle with, get to know that word intersectionality. I know it's really growing in conversation, but it's a really powerful way to think about how we might challenge our privilege in some ways and really be in community as a marginalized person and still hold ourselves accountable. On social media, and I'm moving through these hopefully a little bit quickly so that we can have questions at the end, but we will be giving out the slides, so I think I saw someone ask that. For social media, I know a lot of you are doing outreach work on your social channels. Again, that phrase emotional labor, if on your social media, you can really, especially your personal social media, you can do emotional labor as a person of privilege so that marginalized people don't have to, and really amplify the stories of impacted people. That will really show significant solidarity with impacted folks. So I would encourage you to think about how you can leverage both your church's channel, your congregation's channel, or your personal channels to really do that work. And then as an impacted person, one thing I try to encourage people to do is to really find community on social media. If within private groups, I know for myself, I find a lot of community. I find people who understand me, and those places can a lot of times be safe spaces. So that can also be a way that you can resource folks in your congregation who may not find tons of community within a certain marginalization in your congregation. If you know of any groups that if you know of any groups where those folks could find community, putting them in connection with them can be really helpful. And last, if you're an ally, you want to avoid tokenizing and tone policing. Tokenizing is when you look at one person from a marginalized group and you assume that they need to represent the whole of a stereotype connected with their group. So a good example would be when you hear the phrase token black guy. One person, one black man or one black character put into a movie so that they can say a lot of stereotypes related to black folks and then also simultaneously represent diversity in some way just because they're a one black person in the movie. Well, unfortunately, that same dynamic exists in congregations where a marginalized person will show up and people make a lot of assumptions about what they need to be or who they will be because they are the one person represented from their group within a committee, within a congregation. So you want to be very careful to avoid that. With tone policing, that means that you don't want to center folks' reaction to hurt. You don't want to, not center, you don't want to dismiss or chastise folks for being hurt in reaction to something that's hurtful when you could just focus on not being hurtful in the first place. So when people tone police, they're more concerned that people react in a way that they deem appropriate or proper when they're being discriminated against, instead of ending the discrimination that caused the hurt in the first place. So it's really important as an ally, if you're feeling defensive because somebody has called you out in a way that you don't like, that you really think about why you were being called out in the first place before you get defensive about being called out and how you were called out. And I would say as an impacted person, it's really important to think about whether you should call out or call in, especially if you're in community with folks. Typically, if you can have that private conversation or if you feel like you are in a safe place relationship-wise with folks, it's better to call them in than to call them out. We can move to the next one, Anna. Thank you. So I just wanted to show myself as an example. Here are some of the identities that I hold. I'm a Black woman. I identify as queer. I'm college educated. I do not have a disability, and I'm cisgender, or that means I don't identify, or I am not transgender. So depending on where I show up and who's there, I might be a marginalized or an impacted person. If I show up to a space where there are white folks, then I would be on the margins or underrepresented. As a woman, if I show up to a space where it's mostly men, as a queer person, if I show up in a space where it's mostly straight folks, then I would be an impacted person. I'm called to be an ally to folks who maybe don't have as much education as I have, who maybe don't have the same socioeconomic status as I have, maybe folks who have a disability or folks who are trans, then I would be called to be an ally because I'm not marginalized in the same ways that they are. So I hope that example, if you weren't connecting to what I was saying so far, I hope that example helped. And then I just wanted to use another example using organizations instead of myself, in case this would be helpful. Black Lives Matter is a group of Black folks who are seeking Black liberation. So they are doing work, anti-racism works, and work against anti-Blackness as Black people. So they would be folks who should come to the front of that discussion. They're directly impacted by the injustice that they're confronting as an organization, so they should be out front. Showing Up for Racial Justice is a group of white folks who do anti-racism work, and they commit to working with each other as a form of harm reduction. And they also follow the lead of people of color organizations, even though they're doing anti-racism work, because they realize that they are not directly impacted by racism. So they are an ally. And I just wanted to emphasize that the term ally, I like to think of it like a gift. You can only be an ally if someone has decided, or somebody thinks that you show up in a way where you should be called an ally. Ally is a term that a lot of people like to use just to say that they have concerns about discrimination, or they have concerns about prejudice, or they have concerns about how the world isn't fair. And those concerns are valid, but to me, the phrase ally is really about how you show up. And once you show up and people say that how you are showing up is helpful, then you're an ally. So now we're going to get into talking about how we might want to set outreach goals that center folks at the margin while simultaneously centering harm reduction as a goal. So I just wanted to say that in moving away from, as we talked about in the beginning, the worshiping of numbers, or in moving away from quantifying, using membership numbers as our only way that we really qualify success, it's also not an outreach goal to say that you want to increase a certain type of person. Well, I should say it's not an appropriate outreach goal. So an outreach goal should not be, we want more Black people. We want more queer people. We want more insert anything group of people. That takes us, again, back to focusing on numbers as a goal in itself, and it takes us into tokenizing people and saying that at all costs, we have to get these types of people into our congregation as a matter of, I'm not sure, to suggest that you are a diverse congregation. But what Anna and I are trying to say in centering the margins and outreach is that if the community is vibrant and people of color have access to your congregation, then the vibrancy of your congregation and how you interact with the community should be a reason that people want to come to your congregation. So really, them joining or visiting should be a result of them feeling excited about the work that you're doing and feeling excited about being around you and being in community with you. It shouldn't be as a result of you saying, well, we need to have more Black members, so I'm going to put an ad in the paper on Black History Month. But we can talk about that more during the Q&A. So I wanted to provide some alternatives of what I think would be good outreach goals that would center folks at the margins. Supporting and partnering with frontline community groups. And by frontlines, I'm missing a parentheses there, excuse me, but by frontlines, we mean those who are taking the most risk for the most vulnerable and on behalf of those with the most at stake. We use that term frontline in organizing. So the people who are literally out front, taking risks on behalf of or as marginalized people. So think about how your congregation can really support and partner with frontline community groups. Think about how your congregation can create an inclusive culture where people on the margins feel safe. That would be a great outreach goal. Another outreach goal would be to grow cultural competencies through study and relationship. And in my last outreach newsletter, and I promise this wasn't solely a plug for that, but I can't say it wasn't at all. But in my last outreach newsletter, I talked about how I heard in a podcast someone use the term prophetic instead of marginalized. And the reason they use that term is because they said that people who are prophetic have a complete picture of the world in ways that people who are centered can't have, because people who are centered never have to really, they don't really have to expand their viewpoint or lives or thinking unless they really, really decide to, or unless they're really pushed to, whereas people who are on the margins can see things differently, both in seeing our history differently and more nuanced, and in seeing a different possibility in the future. So I just really loved that explanation and wanted to share it here. And I would love to encourage you to think about doing your outreach work treating marginalized people as prophetic, as if going into relationship with people on the margins means that they have something that you can learn from, that you're not going out to teach them about Unitarian Universalism as a sole goal, that you are not called to save marginalized people, but instead that marginalized people have something that they offer to the world, that by being in relationship with them, you will really grow from it. So I wanted to share this model with you. It's something that I would encourage you to try using as you're exploring outreach goals and you're exploring how to really center the margins in your outreach work. The way that this model works is you first define an outreach goal. And since we're talking about centering the margins in outreach, you could define an outreach goal as it relates to marginalized folks. So remember, I mentioned things about making more inclusive spaces and partnering with different folks in the community, etc. You define an outreach goal, and then you define what the first box says is a pain point. Now, when I say pain point, I'm saying that it could be a potential pain point for folks in the margins who are entering in your congregation. So I'll use myself as an example. I have many pain points as it could relate to visiting a UU congregation. I've had bad experiences because I'm a queer person, so I've had bad experiences with congregations in that vein. UU congregations are predominantly white, so I've had very bad experiences in predominantly white spaces. I've had bad experiences in predominantly white churches. So you could see how, as you start to think about making community for people, really thinking about how folks may experience your congregation is a really key part of being an inclusive space. That's not to say that you want to project pain onto people when they walk through the door and start projecting narratives onto them. It's just really anticipating the ways that your congregation might need to grow so that they don't accumulate more pain onto this person. Then I have what's called a growth point. So the growth point is not a growth point for the person, it's a growth point in the congregation. So you look at your congregation and you say, okay, we have this goal to make X place safer, a safer space in this way, or we want to work with these types of partners. And in working with folks, this is their pain point. This is something we might really need to think about. the growth point is saying, you know, as a congregation, as it relates to really being inclusive in this way, we know that we need to work on insert growth point. It's the ways that you need to grow to make a marginalized person feel more included, safer, etc. And arguably, I agree with the many people who have said that white supremacy hurts us all. So it's not just how to make marginalized folks feel safer. If it's an inclusive space for more people, then the heart of the congregation is going to be better collectively, not just for the people on the margins. And then I have what's called transformative work. So that's saying, okay, we've talked about this pain point, we've talked about this growth point. Now, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to do something differently, study differently? What are we going to do to address the ways that we need to grow so that we can stop creating pain? And then the last part I have is honest messaging. And that means both as the congregation communicates with everyone within the congregation, as you talk about your congregation in the wider world. Honest messaging is all about expectation setting. It's saying, you know, we're not perfect. We've done this work and this work, but we still need to work on this. And in being honest about where you are, you give people agency in determining if it's a place that's safe for them. And that's really centering their well-being in how you communicate about your congregation. And then finally, that puts you at a place where you might be ready to start an outreach plan because you've wrestled with how your outreach goal might need some kind of massaging and work, and your congregation might need some growth work before you get to your outreach plan. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So in this example, a person who is transgender wants a spiritual community, but only has a history with fundamentalist Christian churches. So I'm going to say that your outreach goal is to be a safe and inclusive place or congregation for people with all gender identities, with people who are non-binary, trans, etc. So that's going to be what you aim to be. And that's how, and in creating that space, you therefore would be a place that you could be in community authentically and in a way that would be safe for trans folks. So maybe the pain point for this person is that faith spaces, particularly their previous faith space, can often be extremely binary in language and interpretation, and when they see people coming through the entrance and how they interpret people's presentations, and that also faith spaces can be very transphobic. So that's where the person is coming, when they visit, they are vulnerable because of that pain. So then your congregation note, like as a growth point, says, you know, we want to be a safe space for trans folks, but honestly, we need to grow because we know that the average member will say that they have no problem with trans folks, but they have no idea what it means to actually make a trans person feel welcome and included. So really, the solidarity is symbolic. So then, for the transformative work, and I used a real example, you might choose to do some work, or you might choose to follow the programming or curriculum of the Transforming Hearts Collective, which is a group of trans and queer UUs who have created some language and programming around making folks and congregations more trans affirming. So then your congregation says, okay, we know somebody might feel pain in this way if they visited as a trans person, but we want to be a safer place, but we know that the average person here maybe doesn't know what that means. So we're going to do transformative work and really work on expanding our understanding of what it means to be inclusive and welcoming for trans people. And then when you honestly say where your congregation is, you say you're committed to affirming and supporting trans folks. We also, maybe you then also say that you have a lot to learn and that you're still studying about the intersections of trans identity and spirituality. And then you start to develop an outreach plan, or you start to revisit outreach for trans folks because you know that you've done interrogation into how they would actually be treated once they come to your congregation, opposed to theoretically wanting to be welcoming to them. In this other example, we have that a Black community organizer is seeking healing. Hold on, it's a little, in a city filled with police violence and corruption. So in this example, this would be more traditional outreach in the sense that this person is not necessarily seeking a spiritual community. This would be a person who would only hear about your congregation in another way, because they have not sat down and Googled, I need a spiritual community, I need a church, I need a space to go for worship. They have not looked for those things. So this is a Black community organizer who is seeking healing in a city filled with police violence and corruption. So their pain point is that their city feels unsafe for Black folks and there's no space for Black activists to heal. So it feels like no matter where they turn, there's just nowhere to go for them to feel safe and to work on themselves and to find just general care. And so your congregation wants to reach out to Black folks in your community, but you also recognize that you maybe haven't done as much thinking about your space being intentional when diverse communities come to visit. So you don't really have, for the average person who might just like look up what's happening at your congregation at any day during the week, you may not be doing any study that feels explicitly welcoming or addressing like difference. And then when folks come through, maybe they don't feel welcome, or maybe they feel very othered because there hasn't been a lot of discussion about this. So maybe the transformative work that you do is Blue at a point had made a call to action urging Unitarian Universalist congregations to provide meeting and healing space for Black activists. So maybe you do some study and you reach out to Blue and you do some research and say, what would it take for us to get into the place where we could be a congregation that provides meeting and healing space for organizers and activists without the transactional expectation that in providing that space, they come to visit, but just because you're committed to doing that partnership work. So then maybe when you talk about that whole process and how that felt, you say that you're a congregation with predominantly white members committing to racial justice, and part of that commitment is investing in learning about white supremacy, and also that you're using that commitment to provide space for Black organizers. You haven't said anything about promising that your congregation is diverse, because just because someone comes to a healing space doesn't mean that they're part of the membership. So you haven't tokenized or used that person's identity to say anything that's untrue about the congregation, but you have developed a narrative around the space that you are providing for the organizers. I would encourage you to try this out. We're going to have plenty of times for questions and answers. You may feel so engaged to ask, you may feel so led to ask a question, or you may just want to start thinking through how this would look for your congregation. And this would be a great time to choose an outreach goal for your communications or for your congregation in general, and follow the process that I just outlined. And I would encourage people to do that during our discussion time, or to try it out after this webinar and to let me know how it goes, because I'd be happy to give feedback or just to discuss it. And that takes me out of my portion. I thank you for listening to us for that time period. I hope that you got something out of that you can use within your congregation and within your work. I have not looked at the chat while I was talking, but I'm sure that there are questions or comments. And Chanel, how did you want to go ahead and how did you want to take questions or comments?
Sure. So we can actually have the screen open so I can see all your tiles. So if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Or I think that'd be the best way to go about doing question and answer. So let's go about it that way. So if you have any questions, raise your hands and I will see on your little tile and I will go ahead and unmute you so you can ask away your question.
Yeah, it seems like people were so following along so deeply that we didn't get any questions in the chat. So also feel free to just type in whatever you're thinking or wondering about there too. If you want to work up your courage to raise your hand, feel free to participate in the chat about what's coming to you as well. And we can have a conversation there as well.
I see Anita Favor has her hand up, so I'm going to unmute her and let her ask her a question.
Well, what occurs to me is why congregations would want to do this. You talked about not playing the numbers game and how to engage the congregation in a conversation about why this is important for them to be doing this work.
Anna, did you want me to start off?
Sure.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think aside from a lot of the framing that Anna gave in the beginning about what Unitarian Universalist values call folks to be in the world and how we're called to show up, I think for practical reasons, as outreach director, I get a lot of questions about how to attract insert group. Even though I would not suggest approaching it that way, I get a lot of questions about like, where are the families? Where are the Black people? Where are the queer people? Like I do get questions like that quite often. And I would say that, and I also would insert, where are the young people? And when I see people creating community in free time on Sundays or on weekends, and they're like my organizer friends, or they're my spiritually grounded but not committed to a congregation friends, it's because they find safety. And they are really against the idea of inserting themselves in another place where they have to deal with bureaucracy and where they don't get to feel safe. They feel like they get enough of that at work. They feel like they get a lot of that. They get enough of that with maybe family members that don't treat them right. And they're like, why am I going to put myself in that situation again at a different place? So this is also a way to say that in terms of what I guess, I mean, you could say Gen Xers, millennials. I would argue that it spans across generations, though, when people give negative feedback about about spiritual spaces, about going to church on Sunday. It's often about how they feel they're treated when they go. So I would say that to me would be the selling point, is to say, if you're wondering where the people are, they're in spaces that make them feel okay and safe and validated. So that would be my selling point.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add, if your congregation, I don't want to make any assumptions about your congregation, but if your congregation is mostly white or is mostly middle age or older or is mostly of a certain class, and when people start to ask those questions about where are the Black people, where are the queer people, it's a little, I feel a little like there's some misdirection there as to those questions, but there's also a deeper knowing, right? That maybe there's something not quite right here. Maybe there are other things that we need to be doing. So engaging those questions and going a little bit deeper into what is it that we're noticing about ourselves? What does it mean that we have a space that's safe for people with relative privilege?
And thank you for asking the first question.
We have a question on the chat box here from UCE members, and it says, regarding ally versus impact person, can you please say a bit about how that consideration applies to congregations as a whole, or does it? Does each individual congregant ask this question, or can there be a value for whole congregations asking if they were trying on this model?
I will, because I presented that part, I hope it's okay, and I'll go ahead and start, and then you can add anything you like. I think that, like many things, that's a both and. So I think this question of when it's time for an individual to question this framework, or to use this framework, it would be in both interpersonal, like one-on-one exchanges within the congregation, even if it's a greeter and a visitor, it's how you're showing up in a committee. It's important to think how your identity informs how you might be responding to many things, how you might be responding to critique, how you might be exerting your power dynamics in a way that's making someone feel uncomfortable, how you might be committed to doing something one way and not changing it because you are used to doing it that way, and the way that you do it is seen as more culturally acceptable within your congregation. So I think thinking about that ally versus impacted as an individual is really key to think about harm reduction within how you show up as a person in your congregation and how you show up as an individual within your work. As a congregation, it's important to think about, I think, and folks use this term a lot, but I'm not sure they always interrogate it, systems of oppression and how those systems play out within your congregation. Believe it or not, even though your congregation is a collection of people, it does in its own way have an identity because it's rooted in certain traditions. It's rooted in who makes the decisions. It's rooted in how it spends its money. So in that way, your congregation does have an identity, a persona in the community, a persona in how people experience it when they visit it. And so I would think about how your congregation shows up in the system. Does it disrupt systems of oppression? When people are in community, when people feel outside of community, when people feel rejected, when people feel as if there's no place for them. Why is that? Because they could have a really bad interaction with the person, or it could be the culture that's built within your congregation. And in that way, using the model for both individuals and congregations can be effective. It's really important to interrogate what the dominant culture is at your congregation when you use that model, because that dominant model would really would take on the ally persona. Anna, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm just thinking on the practical level. I am the chair of the communications committee at my congregation, and I'm thinking practically about how do I communicate with my team, right? So we run the website, we do social media, and we do a newsletter, and an email newsletter. We have these various communication channels, and different people on the team have responsibility for those. And having those conversations among the team can be really rich, and allow you to get to a place of clarity around where do I feel like an impacted person on this team, and where do I feel like an ally, and how can we provide a support system for all of us, right? To be able to talk to each other when we have questions. Look, I want to post this, but I'm not quite sure about the framing. What do you think about it? And being able to have those relationships where you're talking about and engaging around these issues is really, a ministry in itself. I mean, it's work. You're having to keep these systems up and running for your congregation, but it's a ministry for those of you involved to be able to have a safe space to talk about these issues.
All right, we've got questions and comments flowing in now. Marche, are you seeing this question from Diana? So our community is inherently homogenous. Our minister's MLK sermon had some folks bristling. Recently had to address that our church's directory, finance, membership couldn't accommodate a new member who didn't identify as male or female. How can we use that as a teaching moment to the larger group?
I'm actually going to let Anna start on this one, and then I'll give feedback, even though my name is mentioned specifically. But
I'm not quite sure how to address the minister's sermon there, but definitely when you find that the actual systems that run your congregation are runs in a way that does not allow for humanity to come into it, right? The full spectrum of humanity as we are. That's really definitely a wonderful opportunity for a teaching moment, like you said, Diana. I would say, I mean, really depending on the size of your congregation and how it's set up, but having an opportunity for listening circles about how people are affected by this. Definitely speaking with an administrator or whoever is responsible for these things, seeing where people are at as far as if they're feeling comfortable enough to make changes, or if there needs to be more dialogue around it, and also not having those conversations in places or in ways that can magnify the harm that these systems can already have. So not putting a person who is harmed by this in the crosshairs of this conversation, and making sure that they're not bearing the brunt of the risk, right? To be to tokenize that person and say, well, this person is the one that's affected, and we need them to advocate for themselves. So keeping all of those things in mind as you have that opportunity for a teaching moment.
thank you, Anna. And I just like to amplify Anna's voice in certain questions, because she is a religious educator, and I just really value her opinion in that way. I would also just say, going back to that whole idea of naming the pain point, and then really thinking about what commitments are people really willing to make for that transformative work. I mean, one thing that is a farce is that people on the margins don't want your money. Like, yeah, we do. What can you find a consultant, or can you find a group that is willing to really work with you and say, okay, you're coming to us honestly about where you are. we're going to do some deep digging into some equity work, some inclusion work. So like, we're going to talk about trans antagonism, heterosexism, and like, you're also going to pay me for it. And I think that would be a really practical way to invest in marginalized communities and also to commit to the transformative work in a concrete way. And I think that one thing we have to do is to move away from a place of shame, right? So to say, like, you know, okay, this process is no longer as expansive as it's not as expansive as we would have hoped. And it could be easy to be like, I am ashamed that we did it this way. I'm ashamed that I hurt this person, and to really get stuck in that shame cycle or spiral, but that's not really helpful, and that won't help your congregation move forward. So really, like, thinking about making space to like tend to the wound, talk about the harm done, but also make room for a conversation about that transformative work. And people are doing this work. People are consulting about it, sharing blogs about it. Like, there are containers for it if your congregation is ready to do it.
So I'm just going to call out a few things here in the chat that have accumulated. So Melinda's asking about how this intersects with congregational mission and discernment and formation. Melinda's facilitating a congregation's capstone event for a mission process. And it's not my role to consult or teach, Melinda says, but leaving this out seems to prevent a congregation from living the promise of our faith and possibly damaging to individuals and society. Janelle from Evanston would appreciate input on the simple goal of wanting to attract people who need our support and sense of community. Susan from Newburyport is talking about how this could be a complex process for a congregation to begin. And so looking to hear a little bit about what you all think about engaging that process and how long it could take to work through it. And then John is asking or commenting and liking the term intergroup marginalization. So a little testimony there.
Anna, if you want to give a few thoughts about how it's related to mission, I can take the goal question. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, sure. I think this dovetails really nicely into missional discernment. This is really what we're talking about, right? In that we're not focusing on growth for growth's sake, but this is a missional way to approach outreach. And so if you have a way to get this recording to them as you're working on doing that discernment, and you know, even dovetailing this process of making an outreach plan as a part of the mission discernment and formation, so that you're really able to line up from your mission, what is your focus, who is your audience, and being able to craft the outreach pieces that align with that. That's really fantastic, because a lot of times we're working with things that have already been formed in silos here and over there and trying to mash them together. So if you can really streamline this process into that, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Anna. I think that's great feedback. Yeah, to me, outreach is really a reflection on how you want to communicate or put the mission into action. So I think you can't separate the two. So thank you for that, Anna. In terms of the feedback on the goal of we want to attract people who need our support and sense of community, I would just offer a few pieces of feedback. I think I really love the spirit of the goal, and I really see an intent to make space for folks on the margin. I would just point out one word, the idea of attracting folks goes back to our idea about it being like we're pulling you in. Like we have something very special. We're the beacon on the hill. Like, come on in. So I would just really maybe wordsmith the word attract a little bit. And then I also, the who need our support. Like I would say, what if it was, we want to support people and provide a sense of community. See how that feels different? That feels so different from, we want to attract people who need our support and a sense of community. It takes away this idea that that you being the benefactor is the main part that we need to discuss. It takes away that this relationship has to in any way be transactional, that the congregation has to be the center of it. It says, you know what, no matter how this ends up, if I never see you again, I want to support you. And that's really what we're trying to say. In terms of what to do with a congregation starting this process, first, looking at our time, I would love to get an email from you, because that is definitely where we love to support you within our work at the UUA. So I would love to hear from you later. It really depends on what you're saying when you say you want to start this work. If you're starting this work in the digital space, if you're really, again, to the previous question, talking about mission priorities and how those mission priorities will live in various places within your work, I would just I'm a really concrete person, and I really just like the idea of setting goals, because then you can really put concrete things, you can attach concrete actions or events or literature or worship songs or whatever that thing may be, community spaces, justice events, whatever that is. If you have a goal, you can then have you can have something to compare your work to. You can say, this hits the goal, this definitely aligns with what we've articulated as our goal, and this doesn't, and this is why. But if you never articulate what you're trying to do, then I think it's really hard to gauge if you've been successful or not.
And also I would add, don't worship the plan or don't worship the goal, right? It's a process. This is something that's meant to guide you, and it's not something that you need to set in stone, to chisel into stone. This is our outreach plan for the next 5 years, and we ain't changing it because it was so hard to get it. It's really looking at it as an adaptive process, to say, okay, we tried this for a month, and actually I think we need to reword this. We do need to wordsmith this. We need to get this into alignment with our mission more, or try it for 6 months and see how it goes. What are your results? Where can you grow? Where can you find more information to get to the goal that you're working on?
It looks like we have one more question. How do you help UU religious leaders who believe our lack of racial diversity is based on theology, not whiteness? What a juicy question. Anna, do you have any thoughts about that?
I need a moment.
You have thoughts about that. I think the question for me is what you mean by help. Raise awareness. Well, first the thought that there isn't racial diversity because of theology kind of erases the many different types of people who are already Unitarian Universalists. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have, for example, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism doing a symposium declaring a Black theology that's happening in the fall. And so there's this whereas some people are trying to figure out how to get interest or how to keep members, you have this segment of people who are drawing in people who have never even heard about Unitarian Universalism. So I think that type of thinking first erases some really, really exciting work that's happening specifically among people of color and various folks. And if people have really committed to dismantling frameworks around white supremacy. I would also encourage them to really think about cultural context. Theology is not, people can have shared theology, but not have a shared understanding of like what's meaningful in a space, what's meaningful in a worship space. For example, I came from a very charismatic tradition. So if I walked into a UU congregation and I really immersed myself in the theology, but someone shushed me because I sang too loud, then I have that's a matter of a cultural difference that has nothing to do with my theological beliefs and understanding. So I think oftentimes when people get uncomfortable around the push for cultural diversity, they lean back into that idea that, oh, people aren't theologically diverse, which I actually think is just completely false. I think that people don't want to expand the cultural context or cultural experiences of certain elements of UU worship, and pushing them to think about that might help expand the conversation.
Yeah, and I also think that, you know, a part of our tradition is the plurality of our theologies, right? And what does it mean if we have spaces in our congregations that don't allow for that plurality to really manifest itself as it really is? So like Marche was pointing to, that's a cultural issue and not a theological issue.
Thanks for the juicy question, Bo. So Anne has asked a question that has gotten a second from Michaela about how hospitality hour after services on Sunday could be a minefield for micro and macro aggressions, especially for people in the margins, and how to approach that. Can we get to that in our 2 minutes left?
Can y'all still hear me? Okay. I will just say there is a wonderful handout. I don't know if you've seen it before, that has like do's and don'ts about coffee hour. And I can make sure that Hillary and Chanel have that so that they can send it out to you as well. Sometimes it just takes some I don't know, subversive strategies, maybe just handing those out during coffee hour and seeing what happens, if that generates conversation. Seeing if there are ways to have conversations around hospitality, or if your minister or a guest speaker wants to do something around that, and engaging everyone around hospitality. A lot of times I think I see this come up when people aren't aware that hospitality is everyone's job. And that's something that I know your congregational life staff have probably reiterated to you many times, that hospitality is something that we all need to be in charge of, or not in charge of, but responsible for.
I think I saw maybe the North Andover folks are passing that handbook around. That's great. So it's definitely out there, and we will share that. I just want to say deep gratitude and bow to Marche and Anna for being our content specialists tonight, and just really demonstrating the wealth of gifts and expertise we have within our association on this topic. And just to reiterate that we will share the recording, the slides, and the resources that we've referenced tonight. And I think most importantly, contact information for Anna and Marche, so that you all can follow up with them about things that you might want to ask more questions about, or work with them more directly. But again, thank you to Marche and Anna for some rich insights and wisdom. Chanel, anything else we want to do before we sign off for the evening?
No, that's everything. You've covered all the bases. Tonight, you're going to be getting a survey in your mailbox from Constant Contact, just to get feedback about this webinar. You can answer that tonight, or you can wake up tomorrow and answer it tomorrow. It will be in your mailbox, and I will likely have the PowerPoint and recording information also out to you all by tomorrow.
Excellent.
So thank you again
Marche
for joining us.
Anna, you want to have the last words?
I was just trying to find our closing words here. Marche
Excellent.
found these. The practice of love offers no place of safety. We risk loss, hurt, pain. We risk being acted upon by forces outside our control. That's from Bell Hooks, from her book All About Love, Revisions. Thank you all.
Thank y'all for having us. Have a wonderful evening.